This week on Scripturology.
Whenever a believer tells me about a particular trial that they have gone through, and it doesn't matter what kind of trial it is, I always like to ask the same question of them. Ask them, tell me how you're different for having gone through this trial. A man looked up from his hospital bed into the face of his devoted wife, and he said to her, "You have been with me through all my troubles. When I lost everything we had because of a bad investment, you were there. When I got fired from my job, you were there. And now I've had this horrible car accident, and you are here. Now that I think about it, you must be bad luck." That's one way to look at our troubles, isn't it? To blame somebody else. Today in our scripturology lesson, we're going to see that it's important that we have a biblical perspective of our troubles. Last week we saw Joseph witness the transformation of his brothers. There were several actions that indicated transformation had gone on. In the first place, they admitted their guilt of selling Joseph, and they called it sin. They affirmed their love for their father Jacob. They mentioned him to Joseph 15 times. They implicitly forgave their father's favoritism of Joseph by embracing and supporting his new favorite son, Benjamin. And the family proved their loyalty to this one brother by going back to Egypt with him when he was discovered with Joseph's cup. Well, how does Joseph respond to what he sees? Let's take a look. We're going to be looking at Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. Then Joseph could not control himself before those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. You know they were. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you have sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say this to him. Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will provide for you. For there are yet 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of my honor in Egypt and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and when Benjamin wept on his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. It strikes me what a tender heart Joseph had This was the third time we have seen this man break down and cry. He started bawling in verse 1 and he's still bawling in verse 15. Now, I'm a big believer in the therapeutic cry myself. Sometimes there just aren't words to express your heart, and so tears can take their place. There's no way Joseph could have expressed verbally all the emotions that he was feeling. And so what he needed to say to his brothers just rolled down his cheeks. When Joseph finally identifies himself to his brothers, they are speechless. Joseph identifies himself again, and this time he adds the phrase, "whom you sold to Egypt." Now, I don't think he was trying to rub that fact into them at that point. I think he was just giving that piece of information as confirmation of who he was, because if you think about it, who else but Joseph would have known that? Just them and Joseph, just the brothers and Joseph. So that would have been convincing. Did you notice what Joseph kept repeating to his brothers? 4 times he says, God was the one who is responsible for what happened to me. Verse 5, he says that God sent me before you to preserve life. In verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve a remnant of his people, and that would have been his covenant people. Verse 8, God has made me a father to Pharaoh. And then again in verse 9, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Now, we're going to put this up on the screen for you because I want you to see something. Look at the first statement. Do you see that Joseph understands there's a purpose to his suffering? It was to preserve life. The same thing with the second statement. There's a definite purpose for what happened to preserve a remnant of God's covenant people. Now look at the third statement. Joseph was made a father to Pharaoh. That was a position of incredible blessing. The same is true of the fourth statement. To be a lord of Egypt would normally be impossible for a Hebrew, who we learned last week couldn't even eat at the same table with Egyptians because Egyptians thought Hebrews were an abomination. How do you explain a Hebrew being lord of Egypt? Here's how I explain it. When God means to bless someone, he does not care what other people will think of it. Joseph had an extremely accurate view of God's complete sovereignty. He knew that God was in control of every situation, and he had an accurate view of God's heart and his intentions toward him. I hear Christians say frequently, God would never cause suffering because he's good. But that is not what we see here, is it? We don't see it anywhere in Scripture. God was good in this situation. God was giving Joseph's life purpose and blessing. But that purpose and blessing came through his suffering. We just want to tell God, you cannot do it that way. Whenever a believer tells me about a particular trial that they have gone through, and it doesn't matter what kind of trial it is, I always like to ask the same question of them. Ask them, tell me how you're different for having gone through this trial. And inevitably, they'll testify that God made them more compassionate or more appreciative, or he taught them to think more deeply, something. But they always recognize after some period of time has passed that God has used this trial for their sanctification. So you can't say that God is not good for accomplishing in us what he has promised he will accomplish in us. This is what the psalmist had to say. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. That's Psalm 119:67. And again, just down a few verses in verse 71. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. And down a few more verses to verse 75. I know, O Lord, that your rules are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. It's not God's ways that have to change. It's our attitude toward them that needs to be the thing that changes. Too many of us view every trial or hardship that comes along as something from the devil exclusively. And we'll pray and we'll believe that God is able to intervene and to rescue us from it. But it's like we don't believe that he had any power on the front end to stop it in the first place. That is a very small view of God. And it's not one that Scripture portrays as biblically accurate. Nothing happens that God does not allow in our lives. Job learned that. Joseph has now figured that out. And we need to get that settled for ourselves. We have got to grow up in our theology and start thinking biblically. When Pharaoh hears that Joseph has been reunited with his brothers, he makes a generous offer for his whole family to come and live in Egypt. And he offers wagons so that their little ones and their wives and their provisions can all be brought down in these wagons to Egypt. And I picture these wagons have signs on them that maybe have a pyramid logo on them and the words Pharaoh's Freight Company on the side. Upon their departure, Joseph sends his brothers off with new clothing for each of them and provisions. He gives Benjamin again more than he's given the other brothers, and they say nothing about it. As they're leaving, Joseph gives one little shot. It's a word of instructions. He says, on the way back, do not quarrel amongst yourselves. Can you imagine that they would have had plenty to quarrel about? I imagine Reuben again breaking out the, I told you so. We shouldn't do this. I can imagine Judah trying to take credit for lifting Joseph out of the pit and selling him to this caravan instead of leaving him there to die for sure in that pit. And I can imagine that they would all argue about who was going to have to tell Jacob that his sons have lied to him for all these years. When they arrive home, and they do tell Jacob about it, the text says they told him, say that they could agree at that one. He doesn't believe their words. Seems like their lies have poisoned his trust in his sons. What finally convinces Jacob is the evidence of all that they've brought back with them, the provisions and the Pharaoh's Freight Company wagons. So old Jacob makes his way down to Egypt with his sons, but they make an eventful stop in Beersheba first. We'll hear about that right after this brief break.